Thank you. You know, tonight we're going to learn about rhinoceros auklets and tufted puffins. And I know for me, it's hard not to look at one of those birds and smile. So I'm really hoping to see a lot of smiles here this evening, along with a lot of great information and knowledge. And I see Janine is, if you can see Janine in here, she's got our mascot flying for for this evening. So, but no, for our program this evening, I'm very pleased to welcome Scott Pearson as our speaker. And Scott is a senior research scientist with the Washington State Department of Fish and Wildlife, where he supervises the West Side research team. Current focus there for Scott is tufted puffin, marbled murrelet, streaked hornlark, and also snowy plover. Scott joined the Department of Fish and Wildlife in 2005 and has been intensely researching, studying, and finding out all kinds of really cool things about seabirds ever since. So, Scott, thank you very much for joining us, and turn it over to you.
Thank you. Go ahead and share my screen. Can you all see that? Great.
We can.
Well, welcome. Real pleasure to be with you all this evening, and love talking about puffins. It's interesting, my journey with studying birds has been circuitous. I did my PhD work studying actually hybridization between hermit and Townsend's warblers. And spending a lot of time with my neck bent and looking up in the ridiculously tall canopy of our forests here in the Northwest. And eventually that led to a fair amount of work looking at frugivory, so the use of eating of fruit by birds. And I did some work, actually, I spent a 2-year stint where I went to South Carolina and looked at those forest management there, and particularly the use of fire, and then how did that affect fruit for birds, and then ended up coming back here and eventually moved and started doing work in seabirds, and that really started in about 2004 and have been studying seabirds ever since. And I really started with the focus on marbled murrelets and have been expanding to a variety of different species as the need has grown. And today I get to talk about two puffins, rhinoceros auklets and tufted puffins, and talk about them in a changing landscape, seascape really. And I will talk in a minute about why I'm calling both of them puffins. Maybe some of you are confused by that, and I will get to that in a minute. But today's talk, what I'd like to do is introduce you to Washington's marine environment. And I know you all being in the Kitsap Peninsula, at least a lot of you, surrounded by Puget Sound, are pretty familiar with at least that body of water. And I'm sure you've explored a lot of other parts of Washington's ocean, or marine environment. And I'll start with the inner marine waters of the Salish Sea, and I'll move to the coast. And I'm going to pretty much do that with just pictures to sort of get us warmed up. No graphs. I know, because I'm a pointy head researcher, I'd love to show graphs, but I'm not going to show too many tonight. I'll show a lot more pretty pictures. I'll talk a little about what a puffin is, and then we'll compare and contrast patterns that we see in the tufted puffin and the rhinoceros auklet. And then finally, I'll move into the conservation status and particularly focus on the tufted puffin. And what does the future hold for the tufted puffin in particular? And then at the end, I want to make sure I give plenty of time for your questions, and we'll try and get those off the chat, or if you raise your hands at the end. It's a little hard because I can't see you all, and it can't have a normal kind of a dialogue where maybe there could be questions during the talk. So I think maybe because of the way we're dealing with this kind of, or with a scenario where we have to be on Zoom, let's, if it's okay, hold off on your questions till the end, and we'll make sure to get to as many of those as we can. So let me start, I'll start with The intermarine waters, which we collectively refer to as the Salish Sea. So when I talk about the Salish Sea, I'm referring to the Strait of Georgia, the Strait of Juan de Fuca, and Puget Sound collectively. They each retain their name, but it's a lot easier to say the Salish Sea than to say the three of those over and over again. And then we'll move to the outer coast. Plus, it pays tribute to the Coast Salish people. Let me start with some early pictures with Puget Sound. And I know you know this world very, very well. And whether you're talking about point, no point, or Marrowstone, like you see pictured here, that world is intimately familiar with you, and you probably visit it regularly. And there are two particular islands in the Salish Sea, and I do really mean the Salish Sea for the entire Salish Sea, the Canadian portion as well, that are really important. The vast majority of all the seabirds that nest in the Salish Sea nest on two islands only. And one is Protection Island, which is found right off of Squim and Discovery Bays. It's an island that's about nearly 2 miles long and nearly 3/4 to a mile wide, made out of sedimentary material that is sloughing off pretty dramatically on the one side. But this island is home to many, many seabirds, and I'll talk a bit about some of those in a bit. And I'm fortunate enough that I'm able to go on this island. I go on it every summer and do a fair amount of research on this island. This island is managed primarily by U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and so is Smith Island. But the one end that you see actually pictured here is managed by the state, and that is part of a refuge that was established quite a while ago by actually folks associated with the Port Townsend's Audubon Society. They were very concerned about the potential loss of the habitat here, and particularly the loss of habitat for tufted puffins and rhinoceros auklets. And they formed together, and that effort was led by Zella Schultz, and that preserve at the end of this island is named the Zella Schultz Preserve, and it's managed by my agency. But the island overall, the vast majority is U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and there's one private residence on the island still. And then there's Smith Island, and very few people get out to Smith because it's kind of off of that northern end of Whidbey, kind of sitting out there all by itself. It looks a lot like Protection, not nearly as tall and not nearly as big. But it, again, is another very important seabird island, an island we visit pretty regularly and monitor the birds on that island quite regularly. These islands are very fragile, and they really couldn't handle human visitation, and that's why the birds are doing well here, because people are not really going on these islands. These islands are riddled with holes, as you can see on the left here, as on Smith Island. All those holes are occupied by really one of three species: pigeon guillemot, rhinoceros auklet, and tufted puffin. And then along the shore, you'll find eggs of black oyster catcher and glaucous-winged gulls, which are extremely fragile, easy to step on. Oyster catcher nests are extremely easy to step on their nests. Their eggs blend in really well with a rocky background. And also, if we're walking on those beaches, we're keeping them from incubating their eggs. And if there's too much activity near their nest, they'll fail. And so it's another reason why it's nice to not have humans on these islands, a place where actually the birds thrive. And then the tufted puffin in particular is extremely sensitive to human activity and very different from the Atlantic puffin that way. Whoops. As I mentioned, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service manages these islands and the coastal islands I'll be showing you a picture of in a minute as part of the Washington Maritime National Wildlife Refuge Complex. It's a series of refuges that were established by Congress at different times, but they manage it as one giant complex. And they do this with a very small staff. There's only one refuge biologist. There's one person leading the team. There's one enforcement agent. There's very few people managing all of these many hundreds of rocks and islands. And then as we move on to the outer coast, this world is extremely harsh and very different from the inland marine. It's not that we don't have harsh environment and we don't have strong winds at times, but we don't get 30-foot combined seas, thank goodness. But this coast does, and it can be pretty dramatic. And somehow those birds have to survive that and live in that environment. And we can start out on Cape Flattery, looking out at Cape Flattery out towards Tatoosh Island. Tatoosh is the only island on this outer coast that really isn't managed by US Fish and Wildlife Service. This island belongs to the Macaw tribe. It's a very important island for a number of different seabird species. And I was very fortunate to have been working with Julia Parrish and other researchers out on this island, and was welcomed to be out there at that time by the Macaw tribe. And as we explore the outer coast of Washington, some of you have been out here and have been fortunate to be in boats and explore it that way. That's the best way to see it. The other great way to see it is to backpack the coastline. But it's not nearly as accessible as the Oregon coast. So people know Cannon Beach, they know Haystack Rock on the Oregon coast, but we don't have those kind of spots that you can just drive up to on the Washington coast. But we have places that are equally as beautiful, and I think actually more beautiful. The coast is very varied in terms of the rock formations, from sedimentary rocks to basalt type rocks. And they're carved and shaped by that just tremendous force of the ocean, making just a very beautiful place. And I should point out that almost all the pictures, unless they're attributed to someone, are pictures I took. So I apologize for having to look at my essentially home movies, but I just harvested my own pictures rather than use others. And it's a dramatic place with these pinnacles and these haystack rocks. Some of them have soil and some of them don't. And they become really important places for both marine birds and marine mammals. And when you fly over it, it's quite dramatic, a really special place. And here you can see a picture that Steve Jeffries took at the time he was counting pinnipeds. So he was counting California sea lions and probably stellar sea lions on this particular spot. It's a spot that has an awful lot of California sea lions on it. In that cave, actually, when they're barking, you come up here in a boat on this one side over here, it just echoes, and the sound of the California sea lions barking is really dramatic. But you notice up here on top there, this island has a fair amount of soil development. It's actually a very large rock. And there are many dozens of pairs of tufted puffins that have their burrows on this island. And then there's some really special places I've been able to go on that people may not have been on for 30 years or more. Here I am on Alexander Island, an extremely steep place, a place where it's very difficult to land. We really don't want people landing. We don't want people going there. And one of the reasons is that we can see here, we actually see native vegetation, which is so amazing to see. All the other islands where people have had access, where there are lighthouses, none of the vegetation is native. It's almost all exotic. But you get on islands like this, you see the native tufted hair grass, and you realize how important that grass is to holding that environment and keeping it from eroding. And there's these large pedestals of tufted hair grass that are 2 to 3 feet in diameter. And they're actually very deep. And when you're walking, you're almost up to your knee in terms of being at the top of the pedestal where your feet are all the way down, buried, and you have to kind of either walk between or you have to hop from pedestal to pedestal. At the base of each one of these pedestals are usually 2 to 3 Cassin's auklet nests. And then up on the top, there are areas where there's storm petrels. There are areas where there's rhinoceros auklets over to my side over here, and behind me, not in my picture, but on this island, would be a place where the tufted puffins are. And then, of course, a lot of us know from exploring that shoreline, it has this beautiful intertidal zone, which is just full of life. And then when I'm out on these islands and I'm supposed to be watching tufted puffins, which are to my left, I often have the sea otters come to my right and behind me, and they don't know I'm there. And I'm able to get within 10 to 15 yards of them. And even though I've got a 100 to 400 millimeter lens, I'm hardly zoomed in here at all. And I didn't need to crop this photo, practically a full frame photo. So they're coming in very close. They don't seem to realize I'm there, or which is really surprising because otters and the mustelids in general, weasels, have this really keen sense of smell. And I think in general, where I sit is downwind from them. And when you approach them on a boat, they'll flee from you if you approach them from upwind, and that our odor moves towards them. And when they're in the water, they'll flee at just tremendous speeds. And the sea otters is a real success story. We get our agency working with US Fish and other folks introduced the otters back to the coast after they were extirpated, and they've recovered at a remarkable rate. And of course, you see all the other you see a variety of pinnipeds. You see harbor seals, just like you see on your beaches on the Kitsap Peninsula, and they pup here. You can see a pup about the age of, it would be weaning. We see the stellar sea lions. We now have pupping stellar sea lions on our northern coast. And we also see pretty regularly California sea lions. They don't pup in the region, or they rarely have, but generally we just see them as they're coming into the region and moving out of the region during the non-pupping season. And then we do see a lot of other different species of pinnipeds as well. And then of course we see the wonderful bird life. We see birds that are in this marine environment, and like the harlequin duck pictured here, but they move into the terrestrial and the freshwater environment to breed. So this is an example of a species that moves up our rivers and streams and nests in cavities of trees. And then we have birds that use these islands and rocks just as they're migrating. So we see our turnstones, both species of turnstones. You see pictured here, one nice ruddy and the mixture, and then in the middle of a bunch of black turnstones. And of course, the pigeon guillemot, which you see off your coastline regularly, and they nest off the Kitsap Peninsula. They nest off these islands as well. They're screaming loudly and creating always a big ruckus. And they tend to look like this as they're screaming at you or just making a lot of noise. They don't seem too bothered though. They continue to feed their young when I'm there. So I'm always paying attention to how I'm affecting the birds around me. Am I keeping them away from feeding? Where am I best situated where I'm having the least amount of impact? And then the other bird that's making a lot of noise are the black oyster catchers. You can see 30 of them assembled in one spot on Destruction Island, for example. They have been nesting in the same places since the 1970s and before. I took Dave Nicewander out to this island. He did his master's research out here after serving in the Vietnam War. He then did his master's work at the University of Washington, and I think it was in maybe 77 and 78 about. He did his work on this species on this island. And I took him back out there maybe 7 years ago, and he said the oyster catchers are in the exact same places, the nest, as they were when he studied them. And their eggs look just like this. They're pretty easily to distinguish in this picture, but imagine if there were bigger rocks. It'd be really hard to see. And this nest actually is surprisingly hard to find. And then of course, there are the predatory birds out there feeding either on the shorebirds like this peregrine falcon or as well as bald eagles. And then there are a lot of surface nesting birds. Brandt's cormorants seem to be somewhat nomadic. When I first started working out at Destruction Island, there were no Brandt's cormorants, and now there are approximately 100 nests of Brandt's cormorants on that island. And then here's a picture off of Tatoosh sitting on what we affectionately call Burning Barrel Point, because that's where the Coast Guard used to burn their garbage in a barrel. And you can see here from Burning Barrel Point, I can see all this line of common murres, and they're nesting on these really steep cliff faces of Tatoosh. And then if we leave that coastal environment and move out into the pelagic world, here we're leaving Cape Flattery at sunrise in a very small boat, 26-foot boat, 27-foot boat, and we're going 60 kilometers offshore. And with a survey team, and as we're going out, we're seeing, of course, rhinoceros auklets in the near shore, common murres. This actually is later in the summer where we're seeing dad chick pairs coming up from Oregon. And then as we get out to the deep water, close to the shelf break, is where we start to see the tube nodes. And that's where we start to see the Laysan albatross, which you see here, the black-footed albatross you see here. This is our most common albatross on our coast. Just beautiful flyers, just spectacular. And then, of course, we see a lot of different species of shearwaters, from the sooty shearwater to the short-tailed to the bullers to a variety of pink-footed, etc. Then as we get out into that deep water, that blue water beyond the shelf break, we regularly see blue sharks. And on this particular trip, I probably counted 50 to 60 of them. And they tend to be just sort of hanging out on the surface. And you see that dorsal fin like you see here. And if you're every so often, if you're really lucky on our coast, and I've only seen 2 of them, you might see a leatherback turtle like this one. And also it's just a spectacular place to see things like the northern fur seal and the Guadalupe fur seal. And they're regularly sunning themselves, putting their flippers out and thermoregulating like you see here. And of course, it's an area with very large whales, humpbacks, a variety of different beaked whales, et cetera, out in this deep water. And then there are a variety of different porpoises and dolphins. Here's a Pacific white-sided dolphin riding our bow wave. We also see a variety of other different species as well. And then out in this deep ocean is where our puffins spend their winter. And we really don't know where they go. We know that they're out there. We know they're in the Pacific somewhere. And we know they're not in the near shore. But we don't know really where they spend their time. And the tufted puffin during the winter looks like this. And looks really dramatically different from what I'll show you of tufted puffins in a minute, what they look like during the breeding season. And you notice here, it's lost this plate on the upper part of its beak. You don't see the tufts. It just looks dramatically different. And so coming back into the near shore, looking at Destruction Island, where I spent a lot of time. And it's a good time to start to think about comparing the rhino and the tufted puffin. And let me start by defining what a puffin is. And probably the best way to do that is looking at it genetically. And here is a tree of relatedness. And this is the Alcidae, or the Alcid family, from a paper by Vicky Friesen. And the 2 species on the bottom are an outgroup. They just help to ground or to root your tree. So they're always added, species that are not Alcids are added at the bottom, and they're just helping to root that tree. Everything else on this tree is an Alcid. And that's everything from dovekies and razorbills to murres to guillemots to auklets, and then finally down to your puffins at the bottom of this tree. And when you look at the puffins, they're all down here. And here are our puffins that we find in North America. And you can see that the most basal of the puffins, so there is the rhinoceros auklet. So the rhinoceros auklet is a puffin. It's not an auklet. It is an alcid, but if you look up further up, you see the auklets just above, and the rhino is actually a puffin. And from the rhino descended the other puffins, and that the next on the tree is the tufted puffin. And then from that came, you see the Atlantic and you see the horned. And you can see why the Atlantic and the horned are sister taxa. They're very closely related, and you can really see that in terms of how they look. You can see those 2 both have that white face, very similar eyes, very similar beaks, very similar black and white patterns. And of these puffins, we can see 3 of them in Washington. 2 breed in Washington regularly, the tufted puffin and the rhinoceros auklet. The horned puffin is a regular visitor to our state. I see them quite regularly, and particularly in the Strait of Juan de Fuca. But they also there's been one hanging out regularly at Smith Island. It's been there annually for a number of years, and it's been actually hanging out with the tufted puffins. And it's been going in and out of burrows. Not breeding yet, no evidence of breeding, and the reason I know it's not breeding is it's going into a lot of different burrows. Any bird that's going into a lot of different burrows, is prospecting, thinking about it, but is not a breeder. Breeders tend to be associated with one burrow, and they're going in and out of that burrow. So let's do some comparisons of the tufted puffin and the rhinoceros auklet. Let's start with distribution. So here we're looking at a distribution map going from Japan all the way through Russia and then over to the United States through Canada and then down to the lower part of the US. And you can see that the tufted puffin has a very wide range going from Japan through islands in Russia, all the way through the Aleutian chain, up into the Bering Sea, through the Gulf of Alaska, and then all the way down into British Columbia off of Vancouver Island, and then finally going all the way down to the Farallon Islands off of California. So a very broad breeding range. And the wintering range is this blue, and it's just portrayed here because we really don't know. It's just somewhere out there in the ocean during the winter. And then let's look at rhinoceros auklets, and you see it's somewhat similar in terms of the breeding range, going from Japan all the way down to Southern California. But the center of gravity, if you will, of the population tends to be here in Japan with a lot of birds, very few birds in the high Arctic areas, and including all the way through the Gulf of Alaska, and the majority of the birds being really in our world and a little bit north, up in British Columbia. And then there are very few birds to the south in California. And then where do rhinos go during the winter? And we participated in a study with colleagues in Canada where we put tags on birds and kept track of them, put a tag on a band on its leg, and that tag helped provide information about where it spent its winter. And then we recovered that tag the next year. And you can see from colonies in the north, so as we go up into the Gulf of Alaska, they tend to spend the winter in that world, but some of them go all the way down into California. And in general, as you're in the north, they tend to stay a little further north. And as you start to go further south with the colonies, it's hard to see the colonies, but there are these little green dots. Lucy's over here. And then as you go down into Haida Gwaii, formerly known as the Queen Charlotte Islands, and then you go further down into the Scott Islands, off of Vancouver Island, places like Triangle. You can see that center of where they're spending the winter is shifting both to the east and to the south. And eventually, as you get to protection here, you see that some of our birds on protection seem to go up here to the north through the Gulf of Alaska, and then some of them went south. So covering a pretty broad area. And then interestingly, all of our birds from destruction, and we had a very small sample size, and that might be why we see this pattern, but they all went south during the winter. And then the Farallones, they all stay south, and then Ani Nuevo, they stay to the south. So where are they in Washington? It's the Tufted Puffin in Washington. These are the colonies where we both historically found them, and we do find them today. Historically occupied ones are in yellow. That means that they used to have puffins, tufted puffins, but no longer do. So none in the San Juan Archipelago anymore. We have 2 sites in the inner marine waters in the Salish Sea that are still occupied, and those are the only 2 sites in the US or Canadian side of the Salish Sea that's still occupied by breeders. And that's Smith and Protection Island, Smith to the north, Protection to the south. And then as you move to the outer coast, you can see that's where the bulk of our birds are. But you can see we've lost a lot of colonies over time. And then if you look at where the rhinoceros auklets are, you can see in Washington that they're on here on the outer coast, and they're also on Protection and Smith. But I've starred the globally important nesting colonies for rhinoceros auklets, and we have one. I published a paper several years ago in the Condor where we estimated the total population of rhinoceros auklets to be around 35,000 pairs on Protection Island. So it's around 70,000 birds. So that's a globally important island for that species. These islands to the north are actually even bigger, but it's about the 9th largest colony for that species. And then where are they where do they spend their time during the breeding season? Let's start with the tufted puffin again. And this is a density map. Areas that are red indicate high densities, and areas in blue indicate low densities. And these are at sea distributions. And you can see they spend a lot of time in the water near the colonies. They also can forage in this area. But also notice this area way out by the shelf break where they're foraging as well. And we think that a lot of the tufted puffins are actually making daily trips between the shelf break and the colony to provision both themselves and their chicks. If we look at the rhino, it has a very different pattern. It's very near shore and doesn't do that shelf break visit, using the same areas on the outer coast, but it's much more near shore in its distribution. And so I'm going to now focus on some of the work we're doing on really on these islands, Smith, protection, and destruction. And destruction, probably a lot of you have seen it. You can see it from Claylock. If you look at Claylock and you look to the north and west, you see an island sitting out there with a lighthouse on it, and that's destruction. And it sits about 2 to 3 miles offshore. And then Protection Island, as I mentioned, off of Squim and Discovery Bays. And then you can see Smith to the north of that. And then all of the work we do are partnerships. We can't do it ourselves. There's too much to do. And so I'm always working with partners. I'm working with the refuge, of course, because they manage most of the lambs, and Sue Thomas, the biologist there. I'm working with Dr. Peter Hodem at the University of Puget Sound. He's a faculty there, and he's been studying seabirds for decades. He's worked in the Antarctic, he works in Chile, and then he works with me on the outer coast of Washington. He has a nonprofit called Oikonos. And then also work closely with Dr. Tom Good at NOAA, who's also a seabird scientist, and then Eric Wagner, who's at University of Washington. And when we're working on these birds, we're often looking and identifying where these burrows are, and they dig burrows into the soil on these offshore rocks and islands. Here on the right, you see Jagged Island, and in this draw on Jagged Island are a bunch of tufted puffin nests. This is a nest I took a picture of a burrow of a tufted puffin on Destruction Island. And this picture on the left, I stole from the internet. And obviously is a crevice nesting tufted puffin. So they will actually nest in crevices. So for example, in the Farallon Islands, almost all of the tufted puffin nests are in crevices and rocks. And in these nests, they actually lay a single egg and only 1 egg a year. And you can see here, this are the slopes of Destruction Island looking towards the mainland and the Olympic Peninsula over here. And this slope is just riddled with holes just like you see here. And you have to be very careful with how you walk on these slopes. The soil is very, very friable, and it's now covered with non-native grasses. It would have had a perennial tufted grass here, which would have held the soil much better. Now it's all cheat grass. That doesn't hold the soil well, and as a result, it's really prone to erosion. If people walked up and down the slope, they'd be regularly crushing these burrows. And if you crush them, you're going to kill the adult in it and its chick and or its egg. And here's a picture I took of this tufted puffin on Jagged. It was above me on the slope, and you can see how it was in there. It was digging away at the front end of that burrow. And they return to the same burrow every year. The pair bond is formed around that burrow. And so both members of the pair return to that same burrow. And that's usually true in burrow nesting seabirds. And then they dig into the ground with that beak, but they're also kicking out the dirt. And sometimes you'll see the other member of the pair sitting out here, just getting covered with dust. The one individual is just sort of kicking out of the burrow. It's pretty amazing to watch. And then these birds are really curious in terms of lining their nests. Rhinoceros auklets and tufted puffins. They usually get material from the slope, from the grass on the slope, and they will line their nest sometimes. But some birds have no lining and some birds have a lot of lining, and it's highly variable and really puzzling. And then this is the only bird that I've ever seen use an aquatic species of plant to line its burrow. I've never seen that other than this bird. As I mentioned, they lay 1 egg, and that they incubate that for over a month. They take turns incubating it, the male and the female do, often on 24-hour shifts. And then they provision their chick, and they're what we call bill loading provisioners. So they're bringing back bill loads of fish as opposed to something like a storm petrel, which regurgitates its food. They're bringing back whole fish stacked in their beak, and that can be one to many. And by many, I've had bill loads of rhinoceros auklets with 26 fish in one bill load. So it's a lot of fish in one bill load. And there are times where they're bringing back so many fish, you're going, how can this chick eat that much? And after they're done eating, they seem to be in a comatose state. I think they are somewhat, they're in a food coma. They grow slowly. And as I mentioned, the pair bond is formed around that burrow. And as a result, if we look at genetic structure and compare it among islands, and here we're looking at that comparing the genetic structure or the genetic information on the relationship among islands here. And here we've got a couple islands in the Aleutians, and then also in British Columbia. So going all the way down to those Scott Islands off of Vancouver Island. And you can see the islands come out as somewhat distinct by color. And that suggests that there's a lot of what we call site philopatry. You return to the same place year after year after year. So as a result, you're much more closely related to individuals on that island than you are on an adjacent island. And that's why you see this pattern of ancestry and descent showing among islands. These birds, when they arrive, there's a lot of social interaction. As I mentioned, that pair bond is formed around the burrow. You tend to see them both not only maintaining that burrow, taking care of their chick, but also there's a lot of social interaction just right outside of the burrow. And as well as you see a lot of wing flaps and stretching. But as I mentioned, you often see the pairs together. And here we're on Destruction Island looking up on the slope, and you can see they're all paired off. And you tend to see the pairs together. There's a lot of interaction between those pairs. They'll do what we call bill claps. Well, they'll clap their beaks back and forth and clap them against each other. And they do kind of like what some of you may have seen in boobies, where they do what I technically could call the silly clown walk. And that's when you're walking along and you're kind of wobbling back and forth and you're going, oh, here's my right foot and here's my left foot. And it's kind of a silly wobble back and forth. And then what I'd like to do is just spend a moment. I've been talking about tufted puffins and them during the day, but rhinoceros auklets are really different. They return to the colony only at night and only after dark. And they return much later if it's a full moon night. If it's a cloudy or foggy night, they'll return earlier. And so here I put out cameras at night, and this camera is on Destruction Island. But if you watch this, you can see all those birds gathering at night. Here you can see there are 4 rhinos in this picture, a lot of social interaction, a lot of moaning and groaning kind of noises, kind of sounds. And the whole island is just raucous with that kind of sound. It's just amazing. Plus they're coming in and leaving and in and leaving. So you hear the and that's happening all night long. It's actually really hard to sleep on these islands. So you can see some of that interaction with beaks, which you tend to see in tufted puffins, but also you can see that braying that they do and with their heads back, and that can hear that really loud moaning and groaning kind of sounds. And if you go on the internet, there's underneath the Encyclopedia for Puget Sound and put in rhinoceros auklet, you can find some recordings that we've put there from when I took folks out on the island. And then also, I think there was a bird note at one point. So you can look that up, maybe just type in the Google bird note and rhinoceros auklet, and you can hear the sounds that they make. On these islands, we have introduced animals that we would like to get rid of. On Destruction, the European hare was introduced by lighthouse keepers, we think in the late 1960s, and are creating real problems. And I'll talk more about that in a minute. And then also adjacent to the rhinos, you'll find the tufted puffins. And the tufted puffins, even though they really only come in and leave, that means fly away from the island and come back to the island during the day. At night, you'll see them going in and out of the burrow pretty regularly and looking around and spending time out of the burrow and coming back. And we only know that because we have these nighttime infrared cameras that are taking these kinds of pictures. They don't put out a flash, they're using infrared. And then, of course, some of our cameras capture birds of prey coming in, of course, trying to get our puffins. Here you can see a juvenile bald eagle. You can see its talon here and the shoulder of its wing here in this picture. And then we will actually go into the burrows with a probe. This is a fiber optic burrow probe, and we use a gaming visor, which you see here. It uses infrared, so no light is being emitted into the burrow. And this is Eric, and he is checking out a rhinoceros auklet. You can see it's tagged here, burrow. So it's tagged, one we return to year after year and see how it's doing. And we can learn about reproductive success that way. And he's seeing what the camera is seeing through this gaming visor on his forehead. And we also mark individual burrows. So we take pictures just like you see here with our cameras, and then we'll number them, and then we'll determine which ones are occupied this year and then how we're doing. And then we also do some work on diet. Rhinos in particular seem to be pretty resilient to us taking some bill loads of fish from them. We've never had failure as a result of our activity. They seem to be really not too prone to problems with human disturbance. The tufted puffin is very different. So we can take a big bill load like you see here. And so this is a single bill load. It's got a couple salmon, and the rest are sand lance. And we find that on protection, almost all of the fish brought back are sand lance or herring. And salmon is actually quite rare. Occasionally you find sand lance, and we tend to find them in the odd year, or maybe it's the opposite of that, I can't remember what it is, when Fraser River pink salmon are out migrating. And we can, as I mentioned, we're situated on rocks, usually at some distance, and we're observing them. And then we also are spending a lot of effort using high-end digital SLRs to try to capture what the tufted puffin is eating, because we don't want to capture them, we don't want to disturb them. And so we're trying to do this remotely. And we tried using remote cameras, we found them really unsuccessful. And the best way is actually someone using a high-end digital SLR who's good at it to capture these bill loads and then to quantify that after. And we brought in one of Peter's students to work on this with us to quantify that. Here you can see a bunch of juvenile fish. You can tell because you can see through the fish. So these are very young fish. And you can see they're all different kinds of bill loads, but we can quantify that because we know what the average length of a bill is, and we can then compare the fish to that length of the beak and estimate its size. So we can look at how is fish length vary among years. So here you're seeing 3 different years on this left graph, 16, 17, and 18. And here we got 16, 17, 18 looking at number of fish. So it's our way of dealing with that issue of them being really prone to disturbance. They tend to eat things like forage fish, squid, and krill. And they tend to forage pretty far offshore for the tufted puffin, more near shore. So let's compare the two. What are we finding in terms of similarities and differences? The rhino tends to have a more southern breeding range. The tufted puffin is more to the north. The rhino tends to be more near shore. The tufted puffin tends to be more offshore. The tufted puffin is the rhinoceros auklet is nocturnal. The tufted puffin is diurnal, comes back to the colony only during the day. And in terms of diet, we're not finding much difference in terms of reproductive success. In terms of diet, but we have limited data for the tufted puffin. But we are finding some really differences in what's happening to the populations, with tufted puffins going down and the rhinos either going up or staying the same. And we're also seeing pretty poor reproductive success in some years for tufted puffins. And so as a result, we considered we wanted to explore more carefully how the tufted puffin was doing. And I was contracted to look at the tufted puffin range wide. And I assembled 11 data sets going all the way from the Aleutian Islands all the way down to the Farallones in California. It had colony-based survey information, it had at-sea survey information. The data spanned 112 years. And what I found, I'm only going to show you Washington data, but in general, we find that there's this dramatic decline over time in the tufted puffin, where we went from many tens of thousands of birds to now, maybe just a few thousand birds remaining. And I should point out, this is hard to see over here, but these are all the islands listed in their abundance. And most of the islands have 0 or very few birds. And just a couple, 3 islands in particular are really important to the tufted puffin: Carroll, Jagged, and Alexander. And then we also looked at how has occupancy of these islands changed over time. I already showed you this figure, and we've had over 50% decline in the number of colonies that are occupied by breeding birds over time. So because of that dramatic decline, we ended up listing it as a state as endangered in 2015. And this is a unique public-private partnership where the Sea Doc Society, Joe Gatos, approached us and said, hey, I'll help you with that status review. I know you're having trouble with not enough money, not enough staff, and how you're going to get this done. And Tor Hansen then worked with us to help get this document written. He really worked for us, but was paid for by the Sea Doc Society. And then we also did a 5-year status review. We decided to keep it as endangered. Again, this was that public-private partnership, again, working with Tor. And we then also wrote the recovery plan. It's the first time we combined in a single document, both how is it doing, status review, and then also that, what are we going to do to help it recover? And sorry, I'm running a bit long and I probably should stop. There are a lot of different factors affecting puffins, and I don't want to go into all of them here. Just to say there is a list of them in the recovery plan, and I can share, or it's available on the web. If you just put tufted puffin, WDFW, and recovery plan, you'll find it. And we're also finding that as warm water events, and this is a coast figure that Julia provided for me, and you can see that these are the dead birds on the beach study. And we're seeing more and more of these large die-offs happening in more recent years, and they seem to be occurring associated with these warm water events. So we're seeing the change in the Earth's climate having a dramatic effect on tufted puffins. And we're having much more stormier events, and we're having these dramatic effects on seabirds in general, and particularly on alcids, on the birds in the puffins family. And we had a dramatic event on rhinoceros auklets just a few years back that was in our world, and some of those washed up on the Kitsap Peninsula. I won't go into that in detail here. We also highlight a bunch of recovery actions, and I won't go through those in detail here today, but just to say they're there. If you want to see them, we've come up with what are the actions we want to do in the near term, what do we want to do in the long term, and how can we help this species? And one of the things we really want to do is get rid of the rabbits on Destruction Island, and I can talk more about that if you have questions about it. And what's happening with the rabbits in particular is we're seeing a lot of erosion and the loss of the habitat where the puffins nest due to grazing from the rabbits. And with that, I just want to say that we did successfully remove rabbits in the past. They were on Smith Island in very large numbers, and they were removed by the precursor of U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. This is an article, for some reason, was published in the Miami Daily News in 1925, and it talks about using strychnine gas to remove the rabbits from Smith Island. So Smith Island had been occupied by rabbits, and they were removed. So I've been talking too long, I've been jabbering on too long, and so I'll stop. And here you can see a tufted puffin actually probably yawning, and the pigeon guillemot probably making a lot of noise.
Well, thanks a lot, Scott. Yes, if you have a question, please go ahead and put it in the chat, or I guess you could go ahead and unmute and ask it now, one of those two options. So we have a question from Mark. Is the decline of the Atlantic puffin in UK similar in same factors? Do you know?
I haven't looked into it closely. There is some decline in some of the colonies in the Atlantic, and some of the evidence points to the same thing. Again, warm water events which affect forage fish in particular. And when the forage fish decline, it's going to be harder for these animals to survive and reproduce. And the cold water is so important to the forage fish, and upwelling on the outer coast is so important. Yes.
And there's a question from Nancy. How many islands make up at the Maritime Project?
That's a good question. I don't remember. I was thinking it might be in terms of rock. So they quantify everything from just the rock itself, like a bare rock that's small. I was thinking it might be 900, but you might look at their website. I know they have a website where they indicate how many it is, but I think it was about 900.
Wow. So Ken has a question. He observed tufted puffin mating in the water. Is that the norm?
That is what we think is the norm. We don't see it a lot. And did you see that off of Protection Island?
Smith.
Okay, yeah, great spot to watch it. There are actually more pairs of tufted puffins on Smith. There are very few on Protection anymore. We have down to just a few pairs. That is the point where I'm worried we're going to lose them.
So Jan is asking if you could comment on the marbled murrelet and how they are doing.
Marbled murrelet's really interesting. It's a mixed bag. I participate in a team that monitors marbled murrelets from here all the way down to San Francisco Bay. And my agency is responsible for doing the inland marine water surveys in the outer coast of Washington, and then others do Oregon and Northern California. And what's interesting is that we're seeing actually stable or maybe slightly increasing populations in Oregon, or at least at sea abundance in Oregon and Northern California. On the outer coast of Washington, we're seeing a slight decline, but that's not significant. And then the inner marine waters of Washington, we've seen pretty dramatic and stable declines.
So I don't have any more questions in the chat, but folks, if you want to ask Scott some questions, go ahead and.
Vic has a question.
Yeah. No, Scott, I just want to say that for a pointy head researcher, you give an awfully good presentation and a really good photographer. I was just quoting you. No, very, very much appreciate you taking time to be with us this evening. Sure. I have a question about coast, and is it Coastal Observation and Seabird Survey Team?
Yeah.
What is that? Who makes it up?
Sure.
What the heck is coast?
Good question. Happy to talk about coast. Coast was the brainchild of Dr. Julia Parrish, who's a faculty at the University of Washington in the School of Fisheries. And she actually, for dissertation, studied schooling behavior and fish. But then did her postdoc work, as I recall, on murres, and then ended up falling in love with murres, and then spent 19 years on Tatoosh Island studying common murres. She's not doing work out there anymore. And then she started COAST, which is a citizen science study where you have volunteers visiting beaches throughout Washington, Oregon, California, actually beaches all the way up into the Aleutians, and counting the number of dead birds on the beach. And at least that's what it started as. They developed a really nice training program to help people quantify the number of dead birds on the beach and help them to be able to determine what species. So you get a toolkit with a nice ID guide on how to identify your birds. And volunteers have been walking those beaches monthly for decades. As a result, it gives us some really nice information on what's baseline mortality, what does it look like? And when do we get these unusual mortality events, which are above that baseline? We expect mortality events, for example, on the outer coast of Washington, of murres post-breeding. So as those dad chick pairs are migrating up the coast, it can actually be a signal of high reproduction. But then there are other times where you get the wrong species in the wrong place at the wrong time. And you know that's a signal that says something's wrong. And then you look at what that might be. Do we have any oiling going on? Do we have an unusual harmful algal bloom going on? Do we have warm sea surface temperatures that might be affecting food? And so it's been just a tremendous long-term study. It's great that people have participated in it for so many years, and it really provides us with a lot of insights. And that program has now expanded to quantifying marine debris as well. And has helped us also to identify stranding events with marine mammals.
Well, Scott, we got a few more questions while you were answering, Vic. So Nancy's asking regarding the rabbits on Destruction Island, are you working with the Quileute and the Ho tribes?
We are. We've started that conversation with them and hoping to continue that conversation because
trying to catch more.
We want to make sure that however we do that removal, that it's done in a way that's sensitive to the island. The island itself is a cultural resource. And then within the island are cultural resources that are really important to the tribes. And so it's important that they tell us, or help us understand how best to do this in a way that has the least amount of impact. I know how to do that from a bird perspective, but I don't necessarily know how to do that from a cultural resource perspective. And so we've already started that dialogue. I'm hoping that there'll be strong partners with us as we do that removal.
Great. So Ruth has a question. How do you tell the difference between a male and a female puffin?
You really can't. By looking at them, they look identical. There's, when you have, for example, a rhinoceros auklet in hand, that horn on the beak is considerably larger in a male than a female. It's not dramatically different, but it's a bit different. And so when I measure those, the horn height, and if I look at the mass, how much it weighs and how high that is, and I compare males and females, you'll find males will score up here as being heavier and longer measurements in general, and females will be generally lighter and shorter measurements. And that's also true in the tufted puffin.
And Jan is asking, is there any information on the impact of aquaculture covering 20% of the tidelands of Puget Sound? There's a decline on the sand lands and the marbled murrelets.
Not that I am aware of. I know that right now that there is a lot of work to try to understand where are important spawning grounds for all of our important forage fish, herring, sand lance, and that's a partnership between the tribes and us and other agencies, because we all realize how important that is to salmon, to our birds, to everything. And so anything we can do to try to protect those spawning grounds, we hope will result in more fish. And then hopefully those forage fish, it's hard to call, I always have trouble calling them forage fish because they're not taxonomically related to each other. And also to a puffin, anything that's shiny and about this size is a forage fish. And so that's juvenile rockfish. That's also salmon would be a forage fish to a puffin. But usually when we talk about forage fish, we're talking about things like sand lance and herring and smelt and anchovy.
And Sid and Carol are asking, how do the puffins retain fish in their mouth while catching more fish?
It's a really good question. To me, that's so fascinating, their adaptation. One thing is, I've been bitten by these puffins a lot, and it's incredibly painful. Well, tufted puffins is incredibly painful. Rhinos just hurts. And part of it is, you can imagine there's probably a lot of leverage in that beak, and it has a very sharp edge. And so they have a lot of power in this beak. Can you see where my pointer is?
Yes.
You notice here is this fold at the back of its mouth. And sometimes that's called a rosette. It can look that way more on a horned puffin. And that expands kind of like an accordion. It allows them to open their beak this way rather than this way. Imagine if you're trying to stack a bunch of fish and your beak opens this way. As you get further out, it's going to be harder to keep them. But if you have equal pressure on all the fish, that's going to help you a lot. And so this adaptation is pretty special in terms of its ability to do that. The other thing is when their mouth is opening, you look at the roof of that beak. there are a bunch of bars on that roof and they all point back. And so they're helping to hold all those fish in place.
Yeah, Grace asked the question, I think you answered it, was what's the function of the bill? Is the function well understood? And I guess you gave a pretty good description of how the puffins use their bill, but I guess.
I mean, it's not as well understood as we'd hope. I mean, we don't know how important it is in terms of, we know that these birds, there's a recent paper looking at if they actually, the birds see in the infrared. And so what they see in terms of when they look at their mate, they see something pretty different than what we see. And it turns out that puffins fluoresce quite a bit and their beaks fluoresce quite a bit. And so that would look very different to a mate than it does to us. And so that there may be other signals going on in that beak than we're aware of. The other thing about the beak is that there are these grooves on the outside, and the number of grooves seem to increase with age. It's something we don't know for sure, but I'd like to, we've been talking to the Point Defiance Zoo, where they have a lot of known age birds, to look at those grooves and are they related to age. It's a project that Peter Hodem's working on with some of his students at University of Puget Sound.
And Bonnie is asking, what is the average lifespan of both puffins?
Yeah, people ask that. They're very long-lived birds. We know that they, in captivity, can live to be over 30 years of age. I know in the Seattle Aquarium, I think there was a rhino that lived to be at least 32 or 33, if I remember correctly. So that they are long-lived, but they probably don't live quite that long in the wild, probably into their 20s, but you probably will get individuals just like you do with albatross, you get those extreme individuals that live a really long time. So you probably have some of those out there. But they don't breed often until they're 4 or 5 years old. So they'll spend those first few years of their life completely out at sea, not touching land at all. And then eventually they'll come back to breed. And that can vary between 3 to 4 to 5 years.
Scott, I had a quick question. You were mentioning that the puffins have predators from the air and some challenges with rabbits, but are any of the predators going after eggs?
No, I've seen ravens try, they put their heads in the burrows. And so unless it's a really rare, these burrows, I guess I haven't talked about how deep they are, but tufted puffins are much shallower than rhinos. Rhinos can be actually several meters deep. So, 9-10 feet deep. It can be quite deep. But they're usually a lot deeper than my arm. So if I put my arm in and reach all the way back, I can't touch the egg. It's a rare occasion when I can touch the egg. So most predators can't reach in far enough. The one exception is river otters. River otters visit all of our islands, even our very far offshore islands. I've seen them on Alexander. So they'll come pretty far offshore, and when they do arrive, they can cause a lot of damage, and they're happy to dig into these burrows and eat eggs and or chicks. So river otters are probably the one exception. And then in terms of aerial predators, I've seen peregrines chasing tufted puffins. I actually have a photograph of that happening. I thought about putting it in, I didn't put it in, but that puffin got away. But I don't know how often they would actually eat one. They tend to be a little more focused on shorebirds and smaller birds, peregrines. But I also find that juvenile peregrines, they try to go after everything. They're actually pretty bad at hunting initially. I don't know if you've watched juvenile peregrines. It takes them a while to figure it out. And I'm always surprised that those young ones actually survive, but a subset of them do.
Another question from Sid and Carol. They're wondering, what depth do the birds fish in the outer shelf? Do they, I guess, dive down and catch fish at different depths?
Yeah, so just got some really exciting information from Triangle Island off of Vancouver Island, that sort of that northwest corner where they put tags on the birds there. And we had estimated they probably are diving to maybe 90 meters. So multiply that by 3 in terms of feet. And so they're going quite deep. And it turns out that they are actually going that deep and a little bit deeper. Majority of their dives are not that deep. Most of them are probably in the 30-meter range, but they will dive quite deep. And when they dive, they're swimming. I should point that out. A lot of people, when they think of seabirds, you think of plunge divers like guillemots or terns, those birds that go from the surface and go just like a knife into the water. And those are plunge divers. They don't swim underwater. They're completely propelled by their speed of their dive. Whereas, I hope I didn't say guillemots. I meant gannets. And then you have your alcids. So all of your alcids they swim underwater, and they swim underwater with their wings. They're not really using their feet much to propel themselves. They probably use that more as a rudder, but they're propelling themselves underwater with their wings. So they're essentially flying underwater.
That's all the questions so far, but appreciate folks asking. Once again, if you have any more questions, please put them in the chat and I'll read them.
May I ask a verbal question?
Sure.
Okay, this is Janine Shutt, and I do a lot of bird photography. You mentioned about having photographers with high-end cameras try to get those photos of the birds coming in with the fish. Is that something that you need some additional help with from people who have the right equipment?
Yeah, we're talking about that right now as a project we're doing with Oregon State. So Peter Hodum and his student started that, and master's student is starting on right now. We're talking about a crowdsourcing approach similar to what they've done with the Atlantic puffin. I don't know if you know about, but there's an effort with Atlantic puffins where they bring all of those photographs in, and then they quantify them to get at diet. And so yes, bill loads would be wonderful, and particularly if you have them around Smith and protection, I'm super interested in those because we don't have a lot of diet information from there.
Okay, yeah, I haven't been up there lately with the camera I have now, but if I get any of those shots, I will send them your way.
Oh, I'd love them, and then we'll just add them to the study, and that would be super helpful.
Okay, great. I'll keep that in mind.
Okay. And the other thing about bird photography, these birds they have very heavy wing loading, and I know that everyone loves to go to protection to photograph that bird on, those few birds on the water. And just one thing about ethics about that, I love to photograph them obviously as well, is that one thing I always try to think about is what am I affecting their behavior? And is the picture really worth it? And just some people, they don't care. The picture is everything. But I find that vast majority of photographers really do care, and they're really careful. And so that's nice.
Yeah, the only time I go near Protection Island is on a boat cruise. It's actually people that know what they're doing to get us in the right spot. So yeah, I appreciate you.
Yeah. And so, I wasn't saying that about you. I was
I know what you mean.
Yeah.
Because I'm the same way with land birds. It's just it's not worth it.
Yeah. But the cost to a Pacific wren of causing it to flee is really different from the cost to a puffin. Because you imagine that wing loading and how much effort it takes to fly. You think about albatross on the wing while soaring is using about as much energy as it is actually when it's just sitting on the water. It doesn't cost that much in terms of flight. But a bird like this, which is designed to go both fly and fly underwater, is really at a disadvantage that way, and it takes a lot more energy for them to fly.
Well, Scott, there's a lot of folks that said very nice, well done, interesting, fantastic, awesome job. There was another question that came up as to Smith Island photos. Would you like last season's photos included of the horned puffin?
Yeah, actually, so you actually have bill loads from the horned puffin, or just of the species? You actually saw the horned puffin carrying fish. Boy, I'd want to know about that.
Ken, do you want to no on the fish?
Okay, yeah, I'm quite sure they're not breeding, but boy, if you saw a horned puffin carrying fish, boy, that would be some evidence that they might be.
Yeah.
But yeah, any years with bill loads in particular, would love those.
Okay, well, I don't see any more, just more folks saying truly wonderful. Thanks But yeah, definitely a great presentation.
Well, you're welcome. Stop sharing.
Hey, Vic, all right. Vic, can you tell us anything about next month's program?
Well, Gene, I would love to do that. And I have a concept that I've been pursuing or did pursue. And we had a speaker that we seem to have lined up, and then health problems overwhelm them. So we're shifting gears. My focus for next month has been to find a presentation or speaker that would be more general to the birds of our area, and heavily focused on photography to get us inspired for the upcoming or the birding season, I guess, as migrants return and we're able to get outside more. And I seem to be cursed, so I am committed to make that happen. We'll get it done, but at this point, I think if you get a call from me, you want to be careful for next month, because we keep running into to issues with folks for next month. So that's what we're working on. Inspirational type presentation for the transition.
Thank you. Thank you.
Gene, one thing I'd also like to say is I'm so grateful for Nate Daniel and his sharing of their Zoom account for our Kitsap Audubon meetings, and I just think this is working so very well, and just so impressed with the good work that Michael Zerlog does as our moderator. I'm thinking he may have a career in like maybe a radio show or something with the good work that he does. Michael, thank you. It's just fabulous. And I've had speakers comment about what a great job you do at the front end of the meeting in welcoming people and just kind of moderating things as they go. And then certainly with the questions. So thank you, Michael, and thank you, Nate.